Jimmy Page was at a party when someone told him, "Jimi Hendrix just called you one of the greatest guitarists in the world." Jimmy should have felt proud, validated, honored. Instead, he felt sick to his stomach. Because if Jimi Hendrix, the actual greatest guitarist in the world, thought Jimmy was great, then either Jimmy was wrong or Jimmy had been fooling everyone, including himself. The praise that should have been the highest compliment of Jimmy's career instead triggered the worst crisis of confidence he'd ever experienced. When your hero validates you, it can feel like they're revealing you as a fraud. The compliment that broke Jimmy Page. London, spring 1968. Jimmy Page was at the peak of his career by conventional measures. The Yardbirds had been successful, and now he was forming a new band, one that would eventually become Led Zeppelin. He was recognized as one of Britain's elite guitarists, respected by peers and critics alike. But respect from peers and critics wasn't what Jimmy had been seeking, not really. Deep down, there was one person whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. One guitarist whose validation would mean more than all the magazine articles and successful recording sessions combined. Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy had studied Jimmy's playing obsessively, had watched him perform whenever possible, had analyzed his recordings, had learned from him both directly and indirectly. In Jimmy's private hierarchy of guitarists, Jimmy occupied the top position. Jimmy was the standard, the benchmark, the guitarist who'd redefined what was possible. And Jimmy, despite his success, had never quite believed he belonged in the same conversation. He was good, yes, technically proficient, creative, successful, but Jimmy was something else entirely, a revolutionary who changed the language of guitar. The party was at someone's flat in Chelsea, a gathering of musicians, producers, music journalists, the kind of informal industry event that happened frequently in London's tight-knit rock scene. Jimmy had arrived late after a recording session. He was tired but in good spirits. The new band was coming together well. He felt optimistic about what they might achieve. He'd been at the party perhaps 20 minutes when a music journalist approached him, excited, slightly drunk, eager to share something. "Jimmy, have you seen the new Rolling Stone, the Jimi Hendrix interview?" Jimmy hadn't. Rolling Stone was an American magazine, not always easy to find in London immediately upon publication. There's a bit where they ask him about other guitarists, who he thinks is great, who he respects, and he mentions you, says you're one of the best guitarists in rock music right now. The journalist was beaming, expecting Jimmy to be thrilled. This was significant news. Jimi Hendrix, the Jimi Hendrix, publicly praising Jimmy Page. This was validation at the highest level.
But Jimmy's reaction wasn't what the journalist expected. His stomach dropped. His chest tightened. He felt suddenly dizzy, like the floor had shifted beneath him. What? Jimmy managed. "He praised your playing, called you one of the greatest. Isn't that amazing?" The journalist was still smiling, still expecting Jimmy to share his excitement, but Jimmy felt like he might be sick. "Excuse me," Jimmy said, and walked quickly to the bathroom. He locked the door and sat on the edge of the bathtub, trying to process what he'd just heard. Jimi Hendrix thought he was one of the greatest guitarists in rock music. This should be the best news of his career, the validation he'd secretly wanted, confirmation that he belonged, that he was worthy of respect, that his playing mattered. Instead, all Jimmy could think was, he's wrong. And if Jimmy was wrong about Jimmy, what did that mean? It meant one of two terrible things. Either Jimi Hendrix, the guitarist Jimmy considered nearly infallible, had made a mistake in judgment, or worse, Jimmy had somehow been fooling everyone, including himself, about his actual level of skill. The imposter syndrome that Jimmy had kept carefully hidden, even from himself, suddenly flooded to the surface. Every insecurity, every doubt, every moment of feeling like he didn't truly belong among the elite guitarists. It all came crashing down at once. Because here's what Jimi knew about himself. He worked incredibly hard to make guitar playing look effortless. Every performance that seemed spontaneous was built on hours of practice. Every innovative sound was the result of meticulous experimentation. He wasn't a natural genius who simply picked up a guitar and made revolutionary music. He was someone who achieved excellence through discipline, preparation, and relentless effort. And Jimi? Jimi seemed to channel something directly from the universe through his guitar. Jimi's revolutionary playing appeared effortless, spontaneous, natural. Jimi was what Jimi thought a true guitar genius looked like. So if Jimi thought Jimi was great, if Jimi put Jimi in the same category as himself, then Jimi must not understand the vast difference between natural genius and hard-earned competence. Jimi must not realize that Jimi's skill was just elaborate compensation for not being naturally gifted the way Jimi was. Jimi stayed in the bathroom for 10 minutes, trying to calm the panic. When he emerged, he made excuses and left the party early. He couldn't face the congratulations, couldn't pretend to be pleased about something that felt like exposure rather than validation. Over the next several days, Jimi couldn't shake the feeling. He obtained a copy of the Rolling Stone interview and read Jimi's actual words. They were generous, complimentary, seemingly genuine. Jimi spoke about Jimi's technical skill, his creativity, his important role in British rock music.
Reading it made everything worse, because Jimi clearly believed what he was saying. This wasn't empty flattery or political maneuvering. Jimi genuinely thought Jimi belonged among the best guitarists in the world. And Jimi couldn't accept it. Not because he was falsely modest, but because accepting it would mean believing he was something he didn't feel he truly was. It would mean taking on an identity, one of the greatest guitarists, that felt like a lie. The crisis affected Jimi's playing. For the first time in his professional career, he found himself second-guessing his choices in the studio. He'd play a part, then wonder, is this what someone, one of the greatest, would play? Is this good enough to justify Jimi's praise? Or is this the moment everyone realizes Jimi was wrong about me? His bandmates noticed something was off. Jimi was normally decisive in the studio, confident about his parts and sounds. Now he was hesitant, doing take after take, never satisfied, unable to trust his instincts. After a particularly difficult session, one of the musicians pulled Jimi aside. "What's going on with you? You're playing great, but you seem, I don't know, uncomfortable?" Jimi considered lying, saying he was just tired or dealing with equipment issues, but he was too exhausted to maintain pretense. "Did you see that Jimi Hendrix interview where he praised my playing?" "Yeah, that's incredible, man. You should be thrilled." I don't know how to explain this, but it doesn't feel like a compliment. It feels like pressure, like now I have to actually be what Jimi thinks I am, and I don't know if I can." His bandmate looked confused. "But you already are that good. Everyone knows it. That's why Jimi said it." "Or," Jimi replied quietly, "everyone's been fooled, and Jimi's praise is going to be the thing that finally exposes the fraud." His bandmate didn't know what to say to that, because imposter syndrome, especially in someone as accomplished as Jimmy Page, seems irrational from the outside. Of course Jimi was that good. His entire career was evidence of his skill. But from inside imposter syndrome, evidence of success doesn't prove competence. It just proves you've been successful at fooling people. And the more successful you become, the more terrifying it is when someone at Jimi's level validates you, because their validation comes with weight, with expectations, with a standard you're not sure you can consistently meet. Jimi spent several days in this spiral. Playing guitar felt wrong. Not playing felt worse. He was trapped between the identity others assigned him and the identity he assigned himself, unable to reconcile the two. What finally shifted things was unexpected. Jimi ran into Eric Clapton at a studio. Eric had heard about Jimi's comments. Word traveled fast in London's music scene. "Congratulations on the Hendrix praise," Eric said. "I don't know what to do with it," Jimi admitted. Eric laughed, but not unkindly. "Let me guess. Instead of feeling proud, you feel like a fraud?" Jimi looked at him sharply. "How did you know?" "Because Jimi said similar things about me once, and I had the exact same reaction. Spent a week convinced he was wrong, that I'd somehow tricked everyone into thinking I could play." "So what did you do?" "Eventually, accepted that maybe my judgment of my own playing is less reliable than Jimi Hendrix's judgment of my playing. Not because Jimi's infallible, but because I'm not objective about myself. None of us are. We know all our failures, all our struggles, all the times we barely pulled something off. Other people just hear the results." This stopped Jimi. He'd never considered that his self-assessment might be less accurate than external assessment. He'd always assumed he knew his limitations better than anyone else could. "Think about it this way," Eric continued. "You've studied Jimi's playing, right? Analyzed it? You respect his judgment about guitar." "Of course." "Then maybe respect his judgment about your guitar playing too. If you trust him to know what good guitar work sounds like, trust him when he says yours qualifies." It was simple logic, but it cut through the spiral. If Jimi respected Jimi's musical judgment, and he did, then dismissing Jimi's assessment of Jimi's playing was actually disrespecting Jimi's judgment. It was saying Jimi knows what good guitar sounds like, except when evaluating me, then he's mistaken. Jimi couldn't argue with that without revealing his thinking was inconsistent. Over the following weeks, Jimi worked on accepting the compliment. Not in the sense of believing he was objectively one of the greatest, that still felt like too much to claim, but in the sense of accepting that Jimi's assessment, based on actually hearing Jimi play, might be more reliable than Jimi's assessment, based on knowing his own struggles. It helped that Jimi reframed what the compliment meant. Jimi hadn't said, "Jimmy Page is a natural genius who makes guitar playing look effortless." He'd said Jimi was one of the best guitarists in rock music. And maybe being one of the best didn't require being a natural genius. Maybe being one of the best could come from discipline, preparation, relentless practice, and genuine creativity, all things Jimi knew he possessed. Maybe working hard to achieve excellence wasn't compensation for lack of natural talent. Maybe it was a valid path to excellence in itself.
The crisis slowly resolved. Jimi didn't suddenly develop confidence that matched the praise, but he developed enough peace with the compliment to keep working, keep playing, keep creating. He stopped second-guessing every choice in the studio. He started trusting his instincts again. And when Led Zeppelin finally debuted and began achieving massive success, Jimi had Jimi's words to fall back on during moments of doubt. Not as proof that he was infallible, but as evidence that someone whose judgment he trusted had heard his playing and found it valuable. The relationship between Jimi and Jimi continued with mutual respect from a distance. They'd see each other occasionally at venues or industry events, exchange brief greetings, maintain the professional courtesy they'd always had. Jimi never told Jimi about the crisis the compliment had triggered. It seemed too personal, too revealing of insecurities that Jimi still wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. But he was grateful for the praise, even if accepting it had been more difficult than anyone watching from outside could understand. Years later, after Jimi's death in 1970, Jimi reflected on that Rolling Stone interview and the crisis it sparked. He'd come to see it as a turning point, though not in the way he'd expected. The compliment hadn't made him more confident, but the process of learning to accept it had taught him something important about imposter syndrome, about self-judgment, and about the gap between how we see ourselves and how others see us. In interviews, when asked about Jimi's influence, Jimi would sometimes mention that interview,
Not the specific words Jimi said, but the lesson of learning to trust external assessment when internal assessment is clouded by insecurity. The thing about imposter syndrome, Jimi said in one interview decades later, is that it feels like honesty. It feels like you're the only one being realistic about your limitations while everyone else is fooled. But sometimes what feels like honesty is actually just fear. And sometimes the people evaluating you from outside can see your work more clearly than you can, because they're not carrying all your doubts and struggles. The interviewer asked if he'd ever overcome imposter syndrome completely. Jimi laughed. "I don't think you overcome it completely. Even now, after everything, there are days I wonder if I'm fooling people. But I've learned that wondering doesn't mean the answer is yes. Sometimes wondering if you're good enough is just what conscientious artists do. It doesn't actually indicate you're not good enough."
He paused, then added, "When Jimi Hendrix called me one of the best guitarists in rock music, my first reaction was to think he was wrong. Now I understand that my first reaction said more about my relationship with self-doubt than it said about Jimi's judgment. Learning that distinction took time, but it was probably the most important thing I learned from him, even though he taught it accidentally." The compliment that broke Jimmy Page was also the compliment that taught him the most. Not about guitar playing, but about accepting recognition without letting it destroy you. About understanding that validation from someone you respect isn't necessarily pressure to be perfect. It can also be permission to trust that your work matters, even when you're not sure yourself. And maybe that's the real lesson of the story. When someone whose judgment you trust tells you you're doing good work, consider the possibility that they might be right, even if, especially if, you don't feel like they are. Because imposter syndrome lies. It tells you everyone's fooled, that you're not as good as they think, that eventually you'll be exposed. But maybe the truth is simpler. You're doing better than you think. You belong more than you feel. And the people recognizing your work aren't being fooled. They're seeing something real that you're too close to see clearly yourself. If this story about accepting recognition and fighting imposter syndrome moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear that self-doubt doesn't mean you're a fraud. Have you ever had praise that felt more like pressure than validation? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to turn on notifications for more untold stories about the human struggles behind musical legends.